and I would have been blamed. Did we not tell you to come straight home? You don't listen.
So one of the things the case when I had said we would do would be like to engage amongst ourselves and also invite you guys into an early engagement. So I know I'm going to read next, but I actually have a question for you now. So I'm going to ask. I feel like the lines between fiction and nonfiction are not as demarcated as people might usually think they are. So I'm curious, what was your inspiration for this fictional part of the story?
I think in this particular section, the only thing that's fictional is the names. These are actually incidents that I know about.
I suspected as much, even though we hadn't spoken about it. So I'm going to read a little bit from my book, The Sex Lives of African Women. It's a nonfiction book. And I basically interviewed women from different parts of the continent and the diaspora over a period of 5 years, asking them about the experiences of sex and sexualities, and wrote each person's story in the first person. The book is divided broadly into 3 sections: self-discovery, sexual freedom, and healing. And I'm going to read a short excerpt from a story that's in the healing section. And the healing. And I'm going to read a short excerpt from a story that's in the healing section. And the healing section tends to look at experiences that people either need to still heal from or are, healing from, in a process of healing from. I'll be reading a story by a woman that I named Esther. Some people chose to use their real names. Some people chose to use pseudonyms. I'm sure we can all understand why in a book about sex and sexualities, people would choose to use their pseudonym. So just to give you some background and information about Esther, at the time I interviewed Esther, she was 28 years old. She identifies as a cisgendered heterosexual woman, originally from Cameroon in the sense that her parents are Cameroonian, but she was raised in Kenya. And when I interviewed her, she was studying in the USA. So I'm kind of reading from the middle, where she's talking about, growing up as a teenager in Kenya and going to a party. At the time, we lived in a gated community, and we had heard about this party that was happening outside our estate. My best friend had been invited by her boyfriend who had just finished high school. I had a crush on her boyfriend's friend, but we had never spoken to him before. Even we regularly saw each other because our friends were dating and we lived in the same neighborhood. At the party, everybody was on the dance floor while I stood in the corner. I was a pastor's child, and so I didn't drink or smoke weed at parties like all the other kids. I was also a bad dancer, and so I just stood on the sidelines of the dance floor and watched everyone else. People would walk out for a smoke or to chat with friends and then come back on the dance floor. My best friend was dancing with her boyfriend, and then he came over to speak to me. It was the first time we had ever spoken. He told me, "I've been watching you. You look really nice." I thought, yes, he's finally noticed me. After chit-chatting for a while, he said, "I need to go home and get a jacket. Are you also cold?" It was about 9 p.m. at the time in a chilly Nairobi evening. I agreed to accompany him home. When we got there, I initially stood outside the gate until he insisted I come in. In the living room, I perched on the arm of the sofa as he went into his bedroom. He turned me around, helped me into the jacket, and turned me around again, so I was now facing him. Then he leaned down and kissed me. It was the first time anyone had ever kissed me. I kissed him back until he started pulling me down towards the sofa. "Sit on me." "No, can we go back to the party now?" "Why? Are you scared? Is this your first time?" "Please, let's just go back to the party." By now we were tussling on the sofa. I kept saying no, and he kept saying, "You don't need to be scared." We were in this unholy dance for what felt like hours. I realized nothing I said was going to make a difference. No one was coming to rescue me. All his housemates were at the party, and he was stronger and bigger than I was. I stopped struggling, and it happened. I felt so ashamed when it was all over. I turned and buried myself deeper into the sofa. I had him walk out, and after a while, he came back in. The party's over, and your friend has left. What am I going to do? How am I going to get home? What am I going to tell my parents? I felt so, it was a struggle to move. I remember noticing that there was no, always thought there would be blood. I ended up spending the night at his house because I couldn't face my parents. I thought the Holy Spirit would tell them what I had done. After all, I had willingly gone to the party, accompanied him to his house, and kissed him back. How was I going to tell my parents that I had done all of that? And I will stop here and pass it on to Pinky.
Thank you, Nana. Of all the stories in the text, why this one? Why pull out this one specifically for sharing this morning?
It's a great question. There are other stories I could have pulled out for sure. But because we've been talking about sexual violence, I think a lot very much at that sort of theoretical, conceptual level, I wanted to bring in an example of somebody who, had experienced sexual violence. So we also had some concrete examples to delve into.
Listening to the two stories, it reminded a young woman who had been essentially to a huge, in Botswana, a huge incident of primary school and secondary school. And as opted, what should be done right, or what are the wrongs at the school, what is happening with education and our children nowadays. And then the story just disappears. And suddenly I stumble across this story by a young woman who confesses to have been across this story by a young woman who confesses to have been one of those that had been coerced by friends, peer pressure, to take this liquid that she thought was alcohol, so that they could go and party at school. And it turns out it actually was, I think it was methanol. It was something truly horrible that they took. The point here is her voice now, so many years later. She's telling us how she really went through hell. Her whole body was burning. She was drinking water, trying to shower. I'd never had this personal perspective. And she was trying she was trying to hide the fact that she was part of the group that had taken this, because some of them had collapsed and they were taken to hospital. But it seemed it was probably because she took a little bit, it was taking long to work on her. And now, so many years later, we learn that she's a mother of 3. She has survived. But before surviving, she had gone through hell, a personal hell, where she'd gone into a coma for a while, come out of it, and was told she would never be able to conceive. She hated herself, became an alcoholic, all kinds of things. Now, these stories, however they make the rounds, I think do a lot in terms of just exposing the multifaceted, multi-layered nature of our different lives. These stories, I think, for me, your story, Suki, your story, Nana, are the kinds of stories that now, because of citizen media, we are able to come across on social media, and they have given voice to those that have otherwise been marginalized. One could argue that a great part of the evolution of our democracy globally has been this opening up of this space that allows these multi voices, that allows voices that you would not have necessarily heard from. And so they make the rounds. And so when I was asked to come and talk this morning, I actually had this in mind. And I thought what I would want to do was probably share 5 points and a story. So it was interesting when my fellow panelists suggested, let's do a conversation, that I thought, okay, perhaps it would work with these. And I'm willing to share the 5 points in this story because I put them together very short, but not before I hear from my panelists.
Okay, I really would just like perhaps to ask, I don't know whether it's one of the points that you're going to make. So we do have these platforms now, like the social media, the digital spaces, but how free are women to share their stories? You know, how, what are the things that work for us, and what are the barriers that make it difficult to be able to share the stories with everybody else?
Yeah, I'm happy to like jump in and speak to that. I have a platform called Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, which I started in 2009 with one of my closest friends. And we started very much sharing our own personal experiences of sex and sexuality. And what was happening very quickly was people were then approaching us and telling us their own stories. And then I would say to them, why don't you write about it? So over time, we had a lot of people who were contributing stories to the platform, and people were contributing overwhelmingly anonymously. Again, makes all of the sense in the world. And then there was one time one woman wrote to me to ask if a comment she had made on the blog, you remember the good old days of people commenting on blog posts? Actually, if a comment she had made could be removed because she had gone for an interview and somebody had asked her about the comments on the blog, you know? And I think that's the challenge. We live in the world that we live in, you know, where people have still very conservative views about sex and sexuality. And when you put something online, it lives there forever, and it can have a real impact on your day-to-day life, especially for people who may work in particular professions. You know, I think some of us, well, very few of us like myself, are lucky to be able to do this kind of work because, you know, we work in feminist spaces, and so we're not impacted negatively. But I think, yes, even with the proliferation of digital platforms, it's not always very.
I would agree. Many years ago, I used to primarily to engender a culture of reading. So the central thing was a book. And for some truly interesting, I have fond memories of that show. Until one day I got a call and I was asked why it was that a lot of the people that come to my show are divorced women. So there. To my point, before social media developed the kind of legs and now wings that it has, media was really very, very patriarchal in so many ways. It was the funding, it was also the personnel, it was just the framing, and the voices tended to be male. So somehow someone realized that here you suddenly have so many voices, and these is unsettling for some people. What has happened with social media is these voices that would have otherwise been marginalized have suddenly found a way almost into
the silencing of women. And I'm thinking here in terms of somebody like Sidangaremba, who was walking during COVID with a placard, really just asking for free speech, and that Hopewell must get out of out of jail, and she got arrested, and I was over at her trial. Well, when they were doing the verdict in Zimbabwe last year, guilty and had to pay like a fine, but also then was told that and the guilt was, or she's guilty of incitement because, or that people who looked at the placard, according to the policemen who arrested her. And so in essence then, now she isn't in Zimbabwe, I think she's in the US. But in essence then, that essentially silenced her, and for the next 5 years, really, she can't really say anything and she can't speak up. But perhaps she's slightly luckier, perhaps, than the young photographer in Nigeria who got shot in Nigeria who got shot and died during the NSAS protest. So how do we maneuver state-sanctioned silencing of citizens, by women in particular?
That's a really hard one. I mean, it speaks to the very theme that we've been discussing. I feel like it's one of the biggest challenges that we have. We're seeing that more and more. You've given the examples that you've given. In my country, people may have heard about the Whole 21, a group of queer activists who were undergoing paralegal training and then got arrested by the police and were basically detained for about 3 weeks until the Attorney General said there was no case under which they could be tried, and they were released. And this is in the context of a coalition of politicians and far-right civil society leaders putting together a bill proposing to basically ban everything from identifying as queer to providing services to support queer people, right? Some of you may have heard of this bill. I know it's been referenced here, what's going on in Uganda, what's going on in Kenya. And at this point in time, the committee that was responsible for reviewing the bill has presented a report to Parliament. And it's quite interesting to read the report because the committee actually somehow does a good balancing job of sharing the pros and cons of the bill, but then still recommends that, yeah, Parliament can vote this bill into like force with some minor modifications, which will criminalize people like me who choose to write about queer identity, which will criminalize a doctor that treats somebody who's queer, which will criminalize a parent if they don't report their child that they are gay. And for me, I'm living this, but it's almost unbelievable that it's happening because it makes no sense whatsoever. And I feel like that's like one of the biggest examples of state-sanctioned violence, because even when these bills have not yet been legalized, it has increased the violence that queer people face, or visibly queer people face, especially, of course, those from lower socioeconomic groups, right? I don't know what we do around this. All I feel like we can do is strengthen the communities that are facing this violence, by supporting them in whatever way they say is needed. One of the pieces of research I have been involved in is looking at the funding that goes towards and against gender justice. So myself and a data investigative journalist, Claire Provost, looked at who are funding these churches in Ghana, like, where's donor money going? And we found to our shock that from 2017 to 2021, donor funding from the UK, the US, Italy, Germany had gone to a number of churches in Ghana that are actually at the forefront of this homophobic bill. And these are not churches that are sort of sitting on the sidelines. These are churches that are doing press conferences, saying to politicians, if you don't pass this bill, we're going to tell our congregation not to vote for you. And we were shocked that they were receiving donor funding, because a lot of these countries are also countries that say they are supporting queer rights, right? So why are you giving money to churches that are super powerful and that are actually causing harm? So we wrote that story. It was published by CNN. CNN also sent their own global investigations team to Ghana to investigate independently, and they did a story which was broadcast on the Christina Mampo show. And I think the fact that feminist movements are underfunded is a form of violence that women experience, especially when we know that the opposition is extremely well funded, because they are funded by individuals, they're funded by corporations, and it's been mentioned in yesterday's session, they are also well coordinated. I think Awino spoke to that, right? That's another example of violence. So for me, part of the solution is also resourcing the communities who are most on the margins and resourcing them directly, not through intermediaries of INGOs, so they only get like a trickle of funding at the end. And it's also like providing communities with resources so they can pivot and do things differently because the situation is fast changing. What you might put in a proposal today as your plan of action may not make sense in a month's time. We don't know what we're dealing with, right? So that's the only thing I can see as a possible solution. How do we strengthen communities that are most in danger, and how do we, like, we need to trust them to figure out what they can do for themselves. And in a sense, we almost need to experiment because we're in uncharted territory. We don't know what will work.
And a lot of the time, we're not even aware of just how extensive the problem is. I mean, your question is the kind that just keeps giving. Zuki, so at the time that the incident you refer to happened, perhaps a lot of attention was paid to Tsitsi Dangaremba because of who she is, because she is well known, because she's written so much. But it was also around the same time that we that were working on women's political participation across Africa, we had sought to set up something that we called Africa Watch, to look out particularly for endangered women who sought to speak out, who sought to be representative, who sought to stand for politics, who were getting violated physically, who in Zimbabwe, you'll get some of those stories if they're still up. Sifiso would know that we put up on. Have to just keep asking questions. What kind of leadership allows? Kind of democracy is this? How is it possible that a government that is supposed to be looking after its citizens can turn on its own citizens? How is it possible that so many years after the world essentially came together in Stockholm and said, what happened in South Africa, where we had a government turn on its own society, on its own nation, should never ever happen, while we as humanity still stand? How is it possible that these things can still happen? And so the importance then of a multiplicity of sources and platforms for voices of all sorts and kinds, whether it be about political participation directly, participation with respect to one's own rights, and just being able to express and say, well, I like this or I like that, be profound or be vain, that these platforms should exist. That, I think, is important. But to my 5 points, they're going to be short. End the story. They relate to just this. You want to celebrate that we have that now in social media, that we are able to use social media. And therefore, we see the proliferation of citizen media. We see that it is truly in vogue. We see this openness. We see that everybody seems to have, most people have recognized that they have a right to voice. And so there's multiplicity, there's even influence, as I spoke to. You don't necessarily have to be a politician to have 100 million followers. Lots of politicians, in fact, don't even have that kind of following. So there are gains. There are gains to this borderlessness, there's fluidity, there is talkback. You can actually tweet something against what the president of a particular country has said. And suddenly, with the kind of following that you have, there's a wave and things actually change. And Zuki was just talking during the break about how the president of South Africa had to step back on an initiative that would have taken essentially food out of the mouths of the impoverished, because Twitter was at it, or as people like to say, Black Twitter. They just simply went down on that flag that was going to be set up. What is it, a statue of a flag that was to be? That's right, but it was going to cost a whole lot of money. So people can talk back in real time, and you actually see policy influence. You see politicians have to change their decisions. On social media, you can pose as whoever you want to be. You can be male, you can be female. Nobody knows who it is. On the day that I feel like I'm male, I go and express myself as male, and nobody can stop that. So you want to express your sexuality, talk to people about your process of becoming. We see that now. There hasn't been space to express this for younger people that might be confused about their sexuality to actually learn from somebody directly and without having to go looking for maybe expensive books. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to take away from the importance of books and the buying of books. But here is another outlet where you can actually engage directly, maybe even send that message, slide in that DM and say, so this is how it happens. What happened with that? And so there is that connection that gets to happen. We have other voices that now proliferate that we haven't heard from before. Traditional medicine, traditional healing. Yes, you still see the stereotypes. Now it's the women healers that are always fighting on social media, for example. But there is so much going on there that gets you to learn more about traditional healing, where before people would not even talk about traditional healing, or traditional healers didn't even have a voice, didn't have a face. There are dangers to that. Some of them are literally prescribing online, and people might actually go and hurt themselves. So there's also entrepreneurship. Suddenly those that didn't have the means to go market themselves, they can just go on social media and sell themselves. And there's knowledge, there's information that is shared there. There's meetings that you can hold virtually. There are also solidarity vehicles that can be set up using social media, such as, for instance, the WPP Africa Watch that I was talking about. Hand in hand with this is also erosion of all sorts of things, of rights. And there have been many instances of people just being maligned, misinformation, disinformation. I can start a campaign against Nana. Oh, Nana is doing all this work on homosexuality or writing about lesbians because she's getting paid by whomever. And I fabricate, and it becomes a life story. And before you know it, Nana has been cancelled. It's dangerous. There's also, there's been targeted instances that I've referred to in the past as media rape, particularly for politicians, female politicians. Memes that are created about them, all kinds. Photographs that get leaked, pornographic in some instances. One of the instances I talk about has to do with a political leader in Malaysia who was doing really very well. And suddenly, it's the end of her career, because here is one political leader who is doing so well in an environment that is very male and is very conservative. And an ex-boyfriend decides to go leak photographs of her that she didn't even know had been taken. So there are dangers to this. The quality gap gets mirrored through social media in this fashion, and even exacerbated. And we become warriors. And this is something that we hardly ever talk about. Our participation, often through pro-participation, where we just are consumers. And it has become part of the culture. It is acceptable that you get up in the morning and the first thing that you do is just go into social media. You imbibe all of these pictures. You imbibe all of these stories, where in the past, perhaps you would have vetted what it is that you read and what it is that you allow into your space. But now, here you are consuming all of this, and so much that would not ordinarily have been becomes normative. So we are part and parcel of the creation of a culture that, if we are not aware of, if we don't do something about, is actually going to be. We see a lot of lascivious consumption, and before you know it, it is acceptable that somebody should be wearing all these things that are written names of good knows who they are, from top to bottom. And this is how our young children also then get to accept a particular culture, and we as the parents buy into it, and we sponsor it, as it were. So do we have challenges even with this, that otherwise seems to bring us an avenue for openness and discussion, and the right, the freedom to do all kinds of things, to connect, to challenge, the right to voice? Plenty. As you can see, it's a chiaroscuro. the media and the social media in particular has become a bit of a runaway fire because there's no real regulation. If we have to come down to policy issues now, there's no real ownership and authorial power. You have it right now. In a minute, it's gone because the minute you write something, you post it, you lose power over it. And people can either go turn that into a meme, fabricate it in whichever faction or however. So this lack of regulation, this openness, it's bad in some ways. But at the same time, I want to argue that it can also be used to influence the environment, the culture, as it were, and to also push for policy change. So if you like, using the master's tools to dismantle the very house of bondage. So here is a possible how. First, it would allow us to go against fragmentation. There are a lot of fragmented efforts at doing a lot of the transformation that we would like to see. But we're not connected enough to actually create a veritable wave. Do we stem the tide? No, not really. Create gatekeeping structures? I don't think that would help. Go back to journalistic basics that say, for instance, that consent is base. I'm not sure that that is doable because this is a generation of global citizens that are so much more at home with this open format that is more and more. I mean, it is actually fanning other. We started with YouTube, there was Facebook. We now have, I don't know, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, the lot. So how do you work with these? Let's see whether we can make the fire work for us is what I want to suggest. That this lack of borders, this access and accessibility, even between citizen and politician, leader, all these be harnessed in a structured way. Predicate a model, for instance, along the work of what Global Citizen has done, where you hold the politicians, all of those countries that have signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, you hold them accountable, get them to make promises. But what we actually really need on our continent is what I want to call a more Africa kind of format. Because we have seen that in the past 10 years, at least as the UN tells us, adverse poverty has halved pretty much. But in Africa, it has actually pretty much doubled. So it's almost as though we are on different planes. There's the globe and then there is Africa. So what we need is something that is focused on us as Africans, campaigns, action, that nexus that brings together the researchers and the creators in the same fashion that we see Global Citizen do. Bring the politicians, get them to say exactly what it is that they are going to do about initiatives that are key to us as Africans on this continent, and then hold them accountable. Let's have this targeted citizens, push for transformation, target governments, target the private sector. See, a movement like this one becomes important because while political parties are key to political participation, they can be extremely polarizing and limiting. I'm not throwing them out, but I do have parties. So we have to do much better because we have so much that is at stake. We need to pull together. Ultimately, then, I think we just need to be really deliberate. We need to be proactive. We need to avail the funds, Mr. Executive Secretary. We need to generate content that will go against the wave. We need to make sure that we distribute it. We make African voices the norm. We create a culture that is that is strongly Africa-centric. And now my short story. See, I chose to propose that we do some stock taking, given a short paper that I wrote, some 14, from which I quote the close. Here is how I closed that little paper. I said, the sophisticated new means of violating women, passing for media work, is just this, a tool of violence. The perpetrators need to be dealt with as fit, and networks need to rise to support of victims. The challenge posed to ethics, human rights, and gender work is clear. Our strategies need to metamorphose with the increasingly morphing nature of gender violence, lest all victories scored to date be wiped off as easily as pressing the delete button on any old computer. And so I am here to follow on and up. Thank you. I took a little longer than I meant to.
Merci beaucoup pour cette conversation très enrichissante qui nous permet justement de voir la question de la violence, du genre au quotidien, à travers les écrits, à travers des récits autobiographiques, des récits de non-fiction, des récits au sein desquels les Africaines, la sphère de la famille, et comment cette violence fait partie des non-dits, des euphémismes. Je reviens un peu au récit autobiographique de Zoukistoire, qui, à travers ce qu'elle nous dit, elle montre comment est-ce que les parents